Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will start in a couple of minutes as we wait for people to sign in for our webinar. I hope everyone is doing well, and it's great to see everybody. Okay, we will start in 1 minute. Hey. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know people are coming in, but I think we have a couple of intro slides, and by the time we begin on the meat and potatoes section, hopefully everybody will be dialed in. Good afternoon. I'm Ji-Heng Lee, Senior Vice President of ACCT, and welcome to our August recess public policy update for all of you. And I'm joined by Katie Brown, who is our Director of Government Relations, and Jose Miranda, who's our Senior Government Relations Associate. So there's a flurry of activity going on in Washington, D.C. right now, and we are trying to provide a lot of updates. But just as a caveat to all of this, we might have another update for all of you on Monday. So we'll see how especially the Senate goes for the next day or two. With this next slide. So a couple of things. These are just some rules for our webinar today. Number one, all the participants will be muted, and that's thank you again for joining us. To ask a question, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Use the thumbs up option to upvote a question in the Q&A if you have a question, or if you want to upvote one of your friends' questions. And this event is being recorded, and we will make it available on our website after this this webinar. So thank you again for joining us. And today's agenda for our webinar is the following. We'll talk to you about the American Jobs Plan and also the American Families Plan. Both of these plans were introduced by the president earlier this year in the spring. We will talk about the bipartisan infrastructure package that's moving currently in the Senate and what's transpiring. We'll have a brief discussion about the short-term amendment that we expect as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and what it portends for the budget reconciliation process globally. If you've been following along, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill are moving together or simultaneously together. Then we'll also be talking about the current fiscal year appropriations process, and especially the labor, HHS, and education appropriations bill. And we'll provide some additional updates on some stuff that's going on in Washington, D.C. And lastly, but not least, we'll provide some answers back to the audience for their Q&A, for the Q&A section. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Katie Brown, who is our Director of Government Relations. And Katie, tell us a little bit about what's going on in the Senate and with all these proposals.
Yes, thanks so much, Jihang, and hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. As Jihang said, we have a full agenda and a lot going on. So I will just get us started. We'll jump right in. Just to give you some quick comments and a recap about the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, I thought this would be a helpful place to start. I know a lot of what we'll be covering today is related to these two pieces. As you'll recall, and as Jihang just mentioned, earlier this year, President Biden outlined his Build Back Better plan, which was originally 3 parts and included the American Rescue Plan, which you'll all recall contained a 3rd round of federal pandemic-related aid, and then corresponding legislation, the American Rescue Plan Act, that was signed into law on March 11th of this year. So there's 2 remaining components to the president's Build Back Better plan. Those include the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. Both measures combined total about $3.6 trillion in funding over 10 years. The American Jobs Plan is geared towards physical infrastructure, job creation, and economic competitiveness. And it has some provisions of interest to community colleges, including notably $12 billion for physical and technological community college infrastructure. There was also a $100 billion pot of funding for high-speed broadband, and then a $48 billion pot of funding for workforce development. And that included both new workforce development funding and then also funding to increase the capacity of the existing workforce system. Additionally, the American Families Plan was the last piece of the Build Back Better proposal to be rolled out. And that plan focused more on human infrastructure. And that included some funding for education, children and families. And I will just point out there that significantly there was $109 billion for tuition-free community colleges, which is obviously very significant for the community college sector. We'll be talking about it a little bit more in depth throughout this conversation. It's also a top campaign priority of President Biden's, as well as for the First Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden, who we all know herself is a community college professor and leader. The American Families Plan, in addition to the tuition-free community college piece, also included a $1,400 increase to the Pell Grant maximum award. I think you all know that doubling the Pell Grant maximum has been a priority of the president's, but also of the larger higher education community. And we also here at ACCT support that priority. And so this would be kind of a down payment towards that investment. And we can go to the next slide. So following the rollout of the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, work got started on the congressional level on a bipartisan infrastructure agreement. There's been longstanding bipartisan support for a comprehensive infrastructure update or, a comprehensive infrastructure legislation, but Congress previously has come close, but they've not been able to reach an agreement in the past on details for this proposal, especially around things like funding and scope, what should be included, and how we could pay for something like this. However, I think given the impacts of the pandemic that we've all seen, I think that Congress, really recognized the timeliness and the need for recovery legislation. And then, so this year, really, infrastructure has become a real-time and tangible priority for both sides of the aisle in Congress. And so after a period of negotiations between President Biden and policymakers on the Senate side, a group of senators unveiled a $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure framework. And that included about $500 billion in new spending, with the rest of the funding coming from previously authorized funding that has been unused, like pandemic aid, and then also ramping up IRS compliance and other things. And then so after they rolled that out on June 24th, the president announced his support for this framework. So it's been a little over a month of policymakers in the Senate drafting this legislation that they're now considering. We saw legislative text be revealed earlier this week. I believe it was on Monday. And since then, the Senate has been debating the bill and they're considering amendments in real time as we speak on the floor. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the content for the underlying bill before we move on to amendments. Not a ton of surprises in the underlying bill. The bulk of the funding is mostly for what a lot of people have been calling traditional infrastructure. So funding for things like transit, highways, airlines, et cetera. There is a $65 billion pot of funding for broadband expansion, which isn't as much as the president proposed, but still very significant. And I'll talk a little bit about that funding and how it kind of breaks down in the bill. The bulk of that funding, about $42.5 billion of that funding, would go towards broadband implementation grants that states and territories could use for broadband projects in underserved areas. And so those, states could probably have a considerable amount of flexibility when deciding on what projects they could use that funding for in their states. I imagine that, after this bill would pass, obviously there would be additional guidance around who could apply and kind of what the stakeholders are that can engage with this funding. But for now, that's the largest piece of the broadband funding is for state implementation grants. Some of the other pieces of the funding, there's a $2.75 billion pot for implementation of the Digital Equity Act, which would direct the Department of Commerce to award broadband grants to historically underserved communities. And then this is broken down between state digital equity capacity grant program, which is dispersed based on a state's population, demographics, and then current broadband availability. And then there's a piece of that funding for a digital equity competitive grant program. And that piece would provide grants specifically to projects that are aimed at digital equity and inclusion. So again, more details probably once these things start getting implemented if this bill passes. I'll also point out that there is a $2 billion pot for tribal broadband connectivity, and then a $2 billion pot for rural broadband expansion, which is obviously, we have a lot of rural institutions and rural communities that we as community college leaders serve. And so this is definitely something that's significant to us, especially given the pandemic brought out a lot of kind of inequities around broadband in rural areas. I'll also just take the time to highlight here that there was a program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which was authorized by, I believe, the CARES Act. I think first authorized by the CARES Act and rolled out, 2021, like early this year, it was opened up for applications. So low-income individuals or individuals that qualify could apply for this benefit program, which would give them a $50 benefit and they could use it for broadband services, internet. I believe there was also a stipend in there for equipment, like a one-time kind of equipment grant. And so basically that program was authorized to only last until the end of the public health emergency, but this infrastructure bill would actually extend it beyond that and drop that benefit down to $30 a month. But I think still, significant that they're keeping it in place. And I will flag here that one of the main beneficiaries of this program are Pell Grant recipients. Pell Grant recipients can apply for this benefit and they just have to prove that they're receiving a Pell Grant. And you can find all of that information on the Department of Commerce's website too. And we've put out a couple of alerts with a link to apply, but we'll continue to update everyone around that. And so the outlook for that bill, and the timeline. I think we thought that the Senate would wrap up debate on this bill and maybe pass it by today, but it looks like there's a long list of amendments to be considered. And we've been hearing that the Senate might take until the weekend to kind of wrap up consideration and pass this bill. So we'll see. And then going to the next slide. As I mentioned, there's been a number of amendments introduced by both sides of the aisle to the infrastructure bill. This one that I'm about to talk about is by far the most significant amendment for our institutions and students. You might all remember that back when there was a competitiveness bill on the floor of the Senate a couple of months ago, and Senators Kane and Portman filed an amendment to that bill that would be very similar to the Jobs Act that they both lead, which the Jobs Act has been a priority of ACCTs and our fields for a really long time. And basically what the Jobs Act would do is it would set up job training federal Pell Grants, and it would extend Pell Grant eligibility to students in short-term programs. So basically they took that Jobs Act language and they negotiated an amendment with the support of Ranking Member Murray from the Health Committee and also, or I'm sorry, Chairwoman Murray from the Health Committee and Ranking Member Burr. So it has the support of Health Committee leadership. And it did not ultimately get included in that bill. And so Senators Kane and Portman thought that it was very germane to the infrastructure discussion, because obviously we know that access to short-term credentials is incredibly important for economic recovery, especially, can be said for infrastructure specific jobs and industries. And so they reintroduced the amendment as part of this bipartisan infrastructure process. And I'll just point out here, the amendment language is very similar to the Jobs Act in that it would extend Pell Grant eligibility to students attending short-term credential programs at public, nonprofit, two-year institutions. Eligible programs would be those that fall between 150 and 600 clock hours of instructional time over 8 to 15 weeks. And in addition to meeting that length requirement, programs must be aligned with the requirements of in-demand jobs. They must also provide a student with a post-secondary credential upon program completion. But in addition to the language that was already in the Jobs Act, this amendment, in order to ensure, quality among program providers for students, it added a few additional quality assurance provisions on top of the Jobs Act language. So it will require that programs yield at least a 20% wage gain for completers. It also has additional disclosure and reporting requirements attached to it. So under the amendment, institutions must disclose information to the student upon their enrollment in a short-term program, including required tuition and fees, completion rate, et cetera. The secretary would also be required to collect data from institutions on number and demographics of students who enroll in these programs. And then the secretary then must produce a report that is available publicly. And then programs that are eligible must be in existence for at least 1 year prior and cannot be 100% online. So those are just some of the additions from the Jobs Act language that will be included in this amendment. The status of the amendment is that it's still awaiting consideration on the Senate floor. So we're still kind of waiting to hear more about timing of when the Senate might take it up. It will require a 60 vote threshold in order to pass. I think, we're pretty confident that based on the support of the Jobs Act and the support in the Senate for the basic principle of short-term credentials and workforce education, we think it has a really strong chance of passing. And I'll just say that this is hugely monumental for our sector. If this does pass, you've all joined with us for quite some time fighting for this change in the Pell Grant program. And I think this moment marks a time where we have support from Senate leaders and we have some movement that we haven't seen before, which is really exciting. And I know a lot of institutions have seen an uptick in enrollment in short-term credential programs despite the overall enrollment losses in the community college sector as part of the pandemic. And I know a lot of states have responded to that by allocating some pandemic aid to covering tuition costs for shorter term programs. And that's great, obviously, for this moment, but I think we'll need like a more permanent solution to make sure that those programs can stay available for students well beyond the pandemic. So this amendment, all that to say, really exciting, and we'll see if we can get it passed. We can go to the next slide. Okay, great. And so in addition to infrastructure, the Senate is also planning to pass a $3.5 trillion budget resolution with reconciliation instructions before recessing for August. So not only do they have to pass an infrastructure bill before they leave, but they're also trying to pass a budget resolution. And as a quick reminder here, budget reconciliation is a legislative tool that is historically used when one party controls both chambers due to the fact that it only needs a simple majority to pass. So in the Senate, that's 50 votes. And the first step to getting a budget reconciliation bill moving is to pass a budget resolution that tells certain committees to change spending, revenues, deficits, or debt limits by specific amounts. So that's a long way of saying that it contains reconciliation instructions for various committees. Once this passes and is signed by the president, then committees can write language to the reconciliation bills that would achieve their targets. And then the budget committee puts the bills all together, and then the House and Senate both have to vote to approve them. And so we know that the House and Senate Democrats are wanting to use reconciliation to authorize funding for American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan provisions that were left out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that they're currently considering. And that includes a lot of our priorities, which I'll talk through in just a moment. But in terms of timeline, the Senate will likely pass this budget resolution, as I said, before recessing. And then the House will likely not begin drafting language that would go with the reconciliation bill until they're back from recess. And the House is not back from recess until September 20th. So we could see language around this reconciliation bill happening end of September, probably at the earliest, but probably we'll see it in October. And that also goes for infrastructure. The House needs to come back in session to pass that bill too. So we'll have a little bit of a gap between when the Senate passes these things and then when the House can continue taking them up. And we also, just a quick note that Speaker Pelosi has indicated too that the House won't pass the infrastructure bill until the Senate starts the reconciliation process. And I think that's just because of momentum. Like, House leaders don't want to see the infrastructure bill be passed and then kind of everything pause on reconciliation. So trying to move these things simultaneously together. And then just taking a look at ACCT's budget reconciliation priorities. Just a note, and we'll talk about this throughout the presentation and probably during questions, that this is an incredibly critical time for advocacy. It's not very often that we see these kind of huge vehicles of funding and legislation that relates to our sector moving kind of back to back. So this is really kind of an exciting time, but it also means that we really need to use and leverage our advocacy to move the needle on Capitol Hill and make sure that policymakers are aware of how important these things are to us. So the priorities that we have, first and foremost, we would like to see a tuition-free community college program included in reconciliation legislation. This has been a really long-standing priority of ACCT's basically since America's College Promise was first rolled out by the Obama administration. We've endorsed the America's College Promise Act again this Congress, which establishes federal state partnership grants to help states make community college tuition free. The chances of some type of tuition-free community college program being included in a reconciliation bill are fairly high, given historical support for this type of program, especially among congressional Democrats. But I think, making sure that all Democrats are on board with this is a top priority for us. Additionally, we support a minimum of $10 billion for a community college job training grant program that's closely aligned with the needs of businesses. I think many of you on this call, if not all of you, know and can recall that during the last economic downturn in 2009, the tax grant program was authorized. And that program is no longer has funding attached to it, but it was largely successful. It was $2 billion over 4 years, and it provided grants to community colleges to help them expand their capacity to work with businesses and provide students with more credentials that they need for the workforce today. And so, given the success of that type of program, combined with the need, the economic need, and then the needs of our students right now, I think, obviously this is a great time for either a tact grant 2.0 or an entirely different community college-led job training grant program that kind of is aimed towards the same goals. And so we've been advocating for at least $10 billion for that. Additionally, and this is an important note too, you'll recall that in the American Jobs Plan that President Biden rolled out, there was a $12 billion pot of funding for physical infrastructure for community colleges. We are asking for $50 billion actually for the improvement of community college facilities. We greatly appreciate the $12 billion that was included in that plan. But I think after surveying and talking to a lot of our institutions about their needs and their deferred maintenance projects and their needs around like new facilities and equipment, we really think that it's been so long since community colleges have had an infusion of funding for their physical and technological infrastructure. So we really think that across the country, we need about 50 billion minimum for that improvement. And I will say, I think, politically, there is support for this type of infrastructure funding. I think right now, congressional leaders are talking a little bit more about a large pot of funding that would go towards school improvement generally, but I think a lot of that funding could end up leaning towards K through 12 institutions, which obviously very important, but we just want to make sure that Congress doesn't lose sight of the importance of community college specific infrastructure funding. So this is our third priority, and these are in no particular order. These are all important. And then last but not least, the president included in his American Families Plan some funding for community college success grants. And these are really geared towards helping students stay in their post-secondary pathways and then complete. Obviously, we've seen a lot of, barriers for students that are exacerbated beyond what they were even before the pandemic. Students not being able to stay in class because they have a job that they need, or they need to, make money or take care of a loved one who's sick. And, we're just hoping to get some type of funding for community colleges to use to help to support their students and make sure that they can complete. So those are our priorities. I'll just remind everyone that, again, it's a critical time for advocacy. We have sent out a couple of campaigns to you all that you could kind of click on and then send this list to your members of Congress. Before this is over, I will drop a link to that campaign in the chat here. And so if you can reach out to your members about reconciliation priorities, now is a great time. And that can even mean, reaching out directly to staff that you have an existing relationship with, sharing like photos, sharing specific examples of need. I think that would be really powerful at this time. So I will stop talking now and I will hand it off to my colleague, Jose, to talk about the appropriations process.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for all of that context. I know it's a lot of information. I hope you're bearing with us. I will provide you all a bit of information of what's happening on the non-reconciliation, non-pandemic related major infrastructure on the annual appropriations process. And before that, I'll just give you a little bit of level setting and context for you to understand how different this year's cycle is from at least the last decade. As you may be aware, Congress has to fund the discretionary side of our government functions on an annual basis. This is done through 12 different appropriation bills, which you may be forgiven to be confused because over the last couple of years, they've all been clumped together into one huge omnibus that has passed at the end of the year for the past couple of years. But typically it's 12 different appropriation bills. They all fund different agencies within the federal government. And the way it's supposed to work and the way it works is the House and the Senate will both pass a budget resolution, which you may have heard of already with Katie mentioning it. The budget resolution, when one party controls all all both chambers of Congress and the White House, can be used to provide reconciliation instructions to move major pieces of legislation, but its primary function is to set the overall number that Congress deems the government should spend on its discretionary side. From this is where the House and the Senate, and just so to avoid any confusion, the president will have to sign whatever comes as a result of the reconciliation legislation that is drafted as a result of the instructions from the budget resolution. But the budget resolution itself does not have to be signed by the president. It is internally for Congress, for both the House and the Senate, to provide their appropriators a top line number on how much they are allowed to spend over the course of the next fiscal year. From there, the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee breaks that down into the 12 different bills, and they provide their allocations, what is known in Congress as a 302B allocation, how much money can each bill spend in their jurisdiction. That has not happened yet in either the House or the Senate, because we haven't had a budget resolution, with instructions yet. What the House did is that they passed what is called a deeming resolution, which provides a top line number for all 12 bills, and it allows the Senate to continue allows the Appropriations Committee to move forward with their work. So the House started the process very, very early on in spring. They had deadlines for members to submit their request by April 30th, even before the president released his budget. Of course, they allowed members to revise their request after the president released their budget based on what they saw the president was requesting. And they moved very quickly to mark up all 12 of their bills and move them out of the Appropriations Committee, which they did by the end of July. And just last week, the House passed on the House floor 9 of those 12 bills. 7 of them were included in a package, which included the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies bill, and then 2 others were separately. Out of the 12 appropriation bills, the only 3 that did not pass the House were the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, the Defense Appropriation Bills, and the Crime, Justice, and Science Appropriation Bills. Those were not passed for political reasons. In part is because leadership in the House determined they may not have the votes to pass them yet, whether that's because of provisions that are included related to the border, related to security, or for a lot of progressive members who were unhappy with the modest increases that the Defense Department received in their appropriations bill. But for the 9 that did pass, those are out of the House. I'll talk a little bit about the Senate in a couple of next slides, but just to talk about the House themselves, the House bills themselves and the labor age specifically, it contains, the labor age bill contains $253.8 billion in funding and includes a 41% increase for the Department of Education. This is going to align very, very closely, but not exactly the same as the request that President Biden made. President Biden also requested an increase of around 40% for the Department of Education. And one thing to note on another, let me backtrack in context setting as well. Over the past decade, Congress has not needed a budget resolution. They have passed them in a couple of years, especially when they had a unified government, but Congress has not needed a budget resolution to set the top line number for government spending and discretionary government spending, because we were under the Budget Control Act, which set specific caps for every year. So since 2011, Congress coming in before the session started already knew how much money they were going to spend. And in fact, every 2 years, they had to come to a bipartisan agreement to raise those caps, because the caps were so low, it would have resulted in a lot of cuts across the board. The Budget Control Act caps ended with the fiscal 2021 appropriation cycle. So this is the first year since the fiscal year 2010 that we have sizable amounts of funding allocated, at least in the House. We don't know what the Senate is going to do yet, but this is why you're seeing funding of these levels up over the past several years. We've been continuously advocating for an increase in a lot of our key priority programs, and we've seen increases to the Pell Grant program. but many of these increases have been very modest or have been level funded at best over several years. But this year, we're seeing significant increases. A 41% increase to the Department of Education is a significant, and I'm talking about significant increase. And this is as a result of no longer being under the Budget Control Act and not being under budgetary caps. Another major change that came about during the 2010-2011 Congress that is different now, and this has nothing to do with the Budget Control Act, but rather with the political dynamics of the time, is that in 2010, earmarks were forbidden. Earmarks is a term utilized for congressionally directed spending. And this is how individual members could direct specific funding to go directly to their districts. That has not been seen over the past decade. There were conversations about bringing it back after 2018 when the House Democrats took back the House. That did not happen then, but it did happen this year. So this is the first year that both the House and the Senate have opened up earmarks to all members, both Republican and Democrat. And there were a lot of reforms from the previous. There's a lot more transparency, a lot of more requirements. There's also restrictions on who can get earmarks. Basically, it's only open for public entities or nonprofit entities, community colleges, public community colleges, obviously one of those that would qualify. And since we know what the House has already passed their labor H bill, we know that a little over $54 million were approved from requests that came from community colleges. So that money will not go through until the bill becomes law. But once and if the bill becomes law and it goes through the entire compromise and conference with the Senate, whatever it may look like, that is very critical funding that's going to go directly to these institutions that apply for earmark requests. They don't have to apply through it for a grant. They don't have to do anything like that. It's just money that's already allocated to them. Just to go a little bit more in depth on what was included in the Labor H bill, and this is just to highlight some of our key priorities. Everything received an increase, some more modest than others, but everything across the board saw some decent increases. I'll highlight a couple of programs here where, as I mentioned, it's very similar to the president's request, but not exactly the same. So the Pell Grant maximum, that is exactly what President Biden had asked. It's a $400 increase. You'll recall the president has expressed support for doubling Pell, and in the reconciliation priorities in the American Families Plan that Katie mentioned, he also proposed a $1,400 increase to the Pell Grant. That is on top of these $400, and he has called it a down payment to doubling Pell. But separate from reconciliation, separate from those $1,400, the House is proposing a $400 increase to the maximum Pell, which is the largest increase we've seen, at least in the past 5 years. Over the past 5 years, we've seen increases about 100, 150, 200, mostly to keep up with inflation. This would actually increase marginally, but it will increase the margin, the purchasing power of the Pell Grant. Another increase was for the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, which helps a lot of students meet unmet needs besides Pell Grant and other state grants. This is one area where the Appropriations Committee deferred from President Biden. President Biden had proposed to level fund this. The House provided a $148 million increase. Other notable increases are strengthening community college training programs. This is actually a bigger increase than what the president had proposed, if I'm not mistaken. In part is because the House had proposed a $55 million increase originally, at least the Appropriations Committee did, to bring up the program to $100 million. And then during the debate on the floor, Rep. Axney from Iowa introduced an amendment to increase this pot of money by $5 million, which passed. So if this number were to stay the same in the Senate, which likely it won't, it would be a $105 million price tag for the program, up from $45 million in FY21. A couple of other programs that increased funding is FIPSI. It received a $127 million increase. There's also a very, very significant increase to the Strengthening Institutions program. This is almost a doubling of the program, and it is exactly what the president had asked for as well. During FY21, the program was funded at $109 million. This provides an additional $100 million to bring the program up to $209 million. And on top of that, there's also additional increases for the adult education basic state grants, as well as CTE state grants. Those increases are a little bit more modest of 50 million each, but it's still funding that is going to be very helpful to our institutions and to our students. Now, switching over to the Senate side, as I kind of provided the context, a lot of it same applies. The Senate still has to provide a budget resolution with reconciliation, but also with a top line number for discretionary spending. That has not happened. Unlike the House, the Senate has not provided a deeming resolution, so they don't even have a working top line number to base their work on. The Senate typically also starts their appropriation process slower and after the House, which they have, whereas the House was full gear on appropriations by March. The Senate didn't really start their process until late May. But one update from something that just happened yesterday, they did start moving forward with some of their appropriation bills. They marked up from their committees 3 bills yesterday: energy and water, agriculture, and military construction and veteran affairs. We don't have a schedule yet of when the remaining 9 bills are going to be marked up, including the labor age bill. And in fact, don't quote me on this, but it is my expectation that the labor age bill will probably be one of the last ones, if it is even marked up. It might not get marked up, it might not go to the floor, just because with this, whereas in the House, the majority party controls everything and they move their priorities as they see fit through appropriations. The Senate is very different. They do need that 60 vote threshold. The committees are equally divided. And so there's a lot of more bipartisanship that is needed in order to move forward with anything. And one of the major obstacles to the labor age bill in the Senate is what we call poison pills, particularly when it comes to abortion and other reproductive efforts that Democrats want to include, that Republicans don't want to include. The Hyde Amendment was removed from the House bill. I don't see how that can happen in the Senate. But because of this, it's holding up the bill. We don't know if we will see it. Obviously, the Senate will have to come up with something by the time they have to go to negotiate with the House. But it's not a guarantee that the bill will be marked up beforehand. One other thing, and that's related to this, is, as I mentioned, earmarks return both in the Senate and in the House. In the House, they're known as community funding projects, and all of those are already listed. It's publicly available. The ones that are funded is known. In the Senate, they're known as congressionally directed spending. The deadline to submit this request passed. The way it works is Senate offices have a deadline to submit the request to the Appropriations Committee, who will then consider everything that they've received and determine which projects get funded. And before that, the Senate offices, then they have their internal deadlines for their constituents to submit their requests to see what could happen. So the labor age deadline for Senate offices was the 1st week of July, which means most of the Senate offices had their internal deadline to probably early to mid-June. I'm saying this just so we think forward, looking ahead, and knowing that this year, the appropriations process was significantly later than usual. It's been late as of late, but that's a lot of late words. During the first year of a president, it is always late. It's always behind because the president has to submit their budget and there's just a lot of delays. While the deadline to submit requests has passed, we will not know which projects were funded on the Senate side until the Appropriations Committee releases their bill and releases the report with the list. We will not see that probably until late September, if not later. Well, probably by late September, we should at least have a sense of them. All of that being said, the fiscal year ends in September 30th of this year. At that point, Congress has three options. They pass all 12 bills on the Senate and the House, and then they go to the negotiating table and they compromise, a conference, and the president signs 12 appropriation bills or an omnibus or a combination of the two, and FY22 starts fully funded. Very, very unlikely for this to happen. Congress doesn't do anything, at which point we go into a government shutdown, which we've seen happen more recurrently over the past 5 years and over the past decade than we normally had prior to that. Or the more likely outcome is Congress enacts a continuing resolution, which allows the government to continue functioning and being funded at the fiscal year 2021 levels, giving Congress additional time to continue working through their appropriation bills and negotiating between the two chambers to see what the final product will look like. The other question there is, and I think it's not more of an if, but rather a when a continuing resolution occurs. The other question will be whether it's going to be a short-term continuing resolution for a couple of weeks or for a month, or if it's going to be a longer continuing resolution that covers through the end of this calendar year, which is what we've seen happen. And considering everything else that Congress is trying to tackle, whether it's the infrastructure package or the reconciliation legislation, that is more likely the outcome. But hey, Congress could prove me wrong and decide they only need a week or two to get it done. And then moving aside from appropriations, just a couple of additional updates that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. You may have seen this through our alerts. You may have seen this on the news, but the Department of Education released an additional $3.2 billion in HERF funding to support students specifically. This was broken down into the following categories. 2.97 billion is formula funding for historically black colleges and universities, minority serving institutions, as well as institutions that are eligible for the Strengthening Institutions program. The allocation tables are found on ED's website on the HERF page. We also send them out on an alert. If you need to track them down, feel free to ask us. We can provide it as well. And in addition to that, there's also $225 million in program grants for public and nonprofit institutions with greatest unmet needs. And the additional update that was, as of last week, coming from ED was that they are going to expand the Second Chance Pell experiment. This experiment was started in 2015 by the Obama administration. It was expanded by the Trump administration. Currently, there are 131 institutions that are part of this experiment. This expansion for school year 22-23 brings in an additional 69 additional colleges, bringing it up to 200 in total. What the experiment does is it allows institutions, as you may recall, currently under law, incarcerated folks cannot utilize Pell Grants to cover their educational expenses that they have while they are in prison. This experiment allows these institutions to provide educational content and educational programs using Pell Grant funds to incarcerated students. You may also recall that in December, when they passed Carissa and the FY21 omnibus appropriation bills, that prohibition was lifted. So technically under the law, you are eligible if you're incarcerated and you're studying, you would be eligible if you meet all the other eligibility requirements for a Pell Grant. However, the Department of Education needs to write the implementation rules for all of this. And when they announced that they were going to expand the Pell experiment, they also announced that the implementation language for this lifting of the ban will not take place until July 1st, 2023. So we're a little bit delayed on the implementation, but given that they are delayed, they're going to expand the current Pell experiment. They've opened up the applications. There's instructions as well. We've sent out some of that information on alerts. If you need to see it, also let us know and we can share that information out again. I'll turn it over back to Katie and Jihang now for some audience Q&As. I know we have a couple on queue already and a couple that we received beforehand through registration.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Katie, for your presentation. We can start doing some questions and answers if you all can submit any as we go through. Dory, in terms of your question, which is, do we have a better chance of doubling the Pell program, Pell Grants, or versus tuition-free community college? One of the things that was mentioned in the presentation was the president's desire to double Pell in addition to free community college. The score for a 10-year doubling of the Pell Grant program is north of $800 billion over a 10-year period. And then the free community college program that was outlined by the president was a little over 100 billion. So when you take those things into account, it's a lot easier to pay for 100 billion than 800 billion. So that's why you're seeing more move afoot to deal with free community college, because the price tag to doubling Pell Grants is very, very high. And so that's something that we'll have to monitor. The Appropriations Committee is looking to do an increase, and the president has outlined a broader increase in his budget reconciliation proposals. So we expect the Pell Grant max to increase, but clearly the resources are probably not there to increase it by over $6,000 in terms of the maximum. Do you want to address Reza's question? I think Reza was talking about the infrastructure package.
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. For some reason, I interpreted his question about the reconciliation bill, so I'll address both. The reconciliation bill, we're not sure like how long the authorizations will be for that. Originally, we thought probably 10 years for grants authorized there. I think now we're looking maybe at more like 7 years, just given the scope of the programs and kind of keeping the cost under control, given how much they want to accomplish in a reconciliation bill. So probably somewhere between 7 to 10 years. And then the infrastructure bill, I believe, is a 6-year authorization. So that's how long those programs would go for. And then Jose, I know there was a couple of questions about earmarks and like where there was one submitted to us about where institutions can find if they did apply, where they can find the list of at least the House grants that were approved. So I didn't know if you wanted to take that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And just real quick on the length of the grants and the sunsets, just a caveat, because I want to make sure that we don't raise your hopes. The price tag right now says 3.5 trillion. That could change, but if it changes, it's not going to go higher, if I'm being honest. So depending on how much Congress wants to get done and how much they want to cover, that could lower the length of the grants, because it will lower the price tag when CBO estimates it. So, right now our expectation, our hope is 7 to 10 years. It could be 5 to 7. Ultimately, it just really depends how they're gonna make the numbers work. I do see I know we had a question from the registration about earmarks, and I'll answer that too, but I see we have another question asking how do earmarks work, and if the senators get their own earmarks allocation different from the assembly members. Correct. So House will have its own set of earmarks, and Chairwoman DeLauro said that no more than 1% of the entire discretionary budget would go toward earmarks. Senate has also done the same thing, a 1% cap. They do get their own different allocations. So when the bills get passed, when they go to conference, when there's an agreement, obviously all the funding for major programs will have to agree, but the funding requests, those are individual. So whatever a House member from Michigan requested is going to be very separate from whatever a senator from Michigan requested. In terms of how does each group prioritize and allocate for projects, that comes down to individual offices and individual senators, individual members, individual senators. And so the committee will determine which projects get funded, and usually they try to base it off of. So when I asked this question to the committee, what I was told was, you should look at the last time Congress allocated funding for projects, and that's probably what they're going to look at in terms of the scope. So they're not going to allocate something that's going to be $50 million for one specific district or for one specific entity. It's probably going to be in the 1 million or lower amount, depending on the program, depending on the scope, as well as depending on what the money is going for. So it's not something that's going to be flooding you with riches, but it's something that can close a funding gap that an entity may have, or a specific small scale project that they may want to get done that's going to be beneficial to the community. And I think this is one thing that both senators and House of Representatives are going to be looking at, is how will this project benefit their constituents? How will it benefit their community? I will say one thing that can probably be beneficial, and this is especially because Democrats on both the House and the Senate were the ones that reintroduced earmarks this year. We know, at least for certain, that we're going to have them again in FY23. Beyond that, it's going to depend on what happens in the 2022 elections, as well as if Republicans want to reimpose a ban or if they want to keep it. Because again, this covers both Democrats and Republicans. But one thing that would be helpful for you, and my recommendation to you, is start engaging with your legislators at the very least at the district level, if not in the DC level, or both, as early as probably January. Once we get through the FY22 cycle, you should start engaging with your offices, asking about what is it that they're looking for projects, what are going to be their parameters. Each member office is going to have a different application or a different set of requirements for their constituents to submit an earmark request. Some Republican members did not take any earmark requests this year. I'm hoping that changes. Some did, a lot of them did, but there were some who just decided not to. So hoping that changes and there's more of an opportunity for everyone to have this funding. But in terms of, I know we had a question about if you submitted an earmark request this cycle, how do you know if it was funded? So for the Senate, we don't know yet. That's a short answer. For the House, because they are trying to be very transparent, if you go to appropriations.house.gov/transparency, and I'm going to put this on the chat, you can see all 12 appropriation bills and you can see the projects that were funded on each bill. I'm going to put that website on the chat, and also I'll put the link directly to the Labor H bill without listing all the projects that were funded. And again, that covers Department of Education, Department of Labor, and Health and Human Services as well.
Great, thanks, Jose. And then Jihang, there was a question, I don't know if you wanted to kind of take it. It was submitted beforehand. It was, what is the outlook for America's College Promise proposal? And then we also just had a question submitted here about which version of the free community college seems most likely to pass. So I'll let you take that one.
All right, you give me all the tough ones. I would say we have a strong expectation that if they decide they're able to move a reconciliation bill process, that free community college will be part of it. We're trying to assess how long the program will exist. So that's one thing that we are trying to assess. But in addition, it appears that there's going to be some trimming within the reconciliation process. So funding trimming. So our expectation is that we will have a free community college provision, but it won't be as quote unquote as generous as it was with the first assessment, which was $109 billion. I imagine that will be well south of $100 billion at the end. And that's just based upon, tea leaf reading about what's happening with the reconciliation process. As an organization, we still strongly support a free community college program that is a first dollar program and not a last dollar program. So that's something that we'll continue to support here. The other thing that we're trying to ensure is that local funds for our institutions are counted within the mix of state dollars, so that'll allow some of our states that are not as well funded in states to be able to participate in all of this Promise program. So those are two pieces of the proposal that we would flag. In states like California, the reality in California is you already have a free community college program, formerly known as a BOG fee waiver. And so for us, all those resources that go to California will also be able to utilize these resources for student services and other student supports. That is not as big of an issue for California, but it is a bigger issue for us as we try to get some states where they have higher tuition fee costs, especially like in the Northeast, to get them in and participate in the program. Are there any other questions before we conclude? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. On behalf of Katie, Jose, and myself, we want to thank everybody for your active participation and support for our legislative advocacy. Just as a note, we encourage you to look at our grassroots alerts that we sent out this past month, and please keep engaged with your legislators, number one. And then number two, we do have our legislative, our leadership Congress scheduled for October, and we're hopeful to see you all there in sunny San Diego. And again, all of our resources are available through our website. And I want to thank everybody again for all your support, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple months. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Jihan, I think Rose Martinez had raised her hand. Not sure if she had a question.
Dory, I know Dory has a question. Dory, at the moment, we are not looking to do a hybrid format. We are fully expecting to be in person, but we will be sending out some type of communication to all those individuals that are registered for our Congress with some guidance on what we will be doing in person in San Diego. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
I need to stop this, right?
Mm-hmm.